Racist woman demands a black girl leave a luxury boutique, unaware her dad owns the entire chain. Spring sunset cast golden rays through the glass dome of Maple Avenue Mall, bathing the marble walls in warm light and making the storefront of La Bellisse Couture, the most prestigious fashion boutique in the area, glow like a Broadway stage at curtain rise. Inside, crystal chandeliers dangled overhead, casting reflections across satin fabrics, mulberry silk, and high-end Italian lace, each item displayed like a vivid work of living art. Andrea Carter, 16 years old, gently pushed open the transparent glass door and stepped into a space designed to make people feel small. She was not small, but the heart in her chest pounded, as if each footstep marked a milestone in her youth. The first time she would buy a prom dress on her own for a nationally recognized event. The Spring Charity Gala, hosted by the Carter Impact Foundation. Andrea wore a simple denim jacket, dark slacks, and crisp white sneakers. A hand-embroidered canvas backpack dangled from her shoulders, the only clue that she was still a high school student. No Gucci handbag, no Louboutin heels, no Rolex like the women casually browsing the racks around her. Yet she showed no signs of discomfort. In Andrea's eyes, this wasn't a place to prove status. It was a space where she could exercise a profound kind of equality, the right to choose the most beautiful thing for herself. The boutique was as silent as a fashion sanctuary. The dresses were displayed in glass cases like ancient sculptures, some priced as high as $18,200, with every seam protected under LED lights, carefully calibrated to prevent fabric discoloration. Here, customers were served exclusive French champagne, custom-embroidered handkerchiefs, and silk gloves for those trying on white gowns. That was the standard, but not for everyone, only for the right kind of people. Andrea paid no attention to any of that. She moved slowly past the racks, her eyes wide with wonder at each fabric, fingertips gently brushing over layers of lace and tiny beaded embellishments. With every gown she touched, she imagined herself at the gala, where she would speak as the youth representative for a public education campaign, honored alongside media figures and major donors. In her hand was a personal invitation, the kind with gilded edges and a numbered seat, sent directly from the office of the foundation founded by her father. But no one in the boutique knew that Andrea's father wasn't just the event organizer. He was David Carter, the man behind more than 60 luxury fashion stores across the United States, including La Bellisse Couture. Andrea stopped in front of a long emerald green gown made from fabric imported from Lyon, France, its bodice adorned with authentic Austrian Swarovski crystals that shimmered like starlight when one turned. Her eyes lit up. She gently lifted the dress, held it against her body. For the first time that day, she smiled fully, not because of the dress's beauty, but because it felt like she had found something that truly belonged to her. She had no idea that, from across the room, behind a towering floral column and the latest season's racks, a pair of eyes had been watching her from the moment she entered, cold, sharp, and laced with judgment. To that woman, Andrea's presence, a young black girl without a luxury purse, was nothing short of a blot of ink on white silk. And that was when prejudice began to stir. In a place where the lighting was calibrated down to each lux to make fabric appear ethereal, Constance Whitmore's gaze was as cold as a scalpel, precise, sharp, and steeped in prejudice. She stood before a full-length gilded mirror, adjusting the collar of her ivory hand-embroidered cashmere coat, custom-made by a designer at 6 Rue Cambon, Paris. On her right wrist, a Patek Philippe Grand Complications watch, worth over $89,500, caught the light with every subtle hand movement, a silent declaration. I belong to the untouchable class. At 52, Constance was the embodiment of splendid conservatism, the ex-wife of a state senator and current chairwoman of the Legacy of Excellence Foundation, which exclusively awarded scholarships to white female students pursuing traditional arts. She considered herself a guardian of cultural standards among the elite. With soft ash-blonde waves styled in vintage curls, deep wine-red lipstick, and a storm-gray Hermes Birkin bag, one of only 50 in existence, every step she took radiated a subtle kind of power. Power, the kind that didn't shout, only looked. When Andrea Carter entered the boutique, modest in appearance but confident in stride, she did not escape Constance's finely honed scrutiny. It wasn't the sneakers, nor the canvas backpack, but the bronze-brown tone of her skin under the boutique's lights that made Constance's expression tighten. It wasn't a simple frown. It was the involuntary recoil of someone long accustomed to a world cleansed of diversity. Constance turned slightly toward the woman beside her, Mrs. Eleanor Mapleton, widow of a famous vintner, and murmured with deliberate enunciation, "Is it that anyone can just walk in here nowadays?" The words floated through the air, soft as silk, sharp as a razor blade. Eleanor merely offered a faint, tight-lipped smile in response, saying nothing, but her eyes immediately shifted toward Andrea, a reflex born from years of seeing the world through the lens of class. Constance didn't stop there. She walked slowly past each display, her diamond-encrusted cushion-cut 4-carat ring brushing over the fabrics, as if testing their worth, though her eyes never left Andrea for even half a second. Olivia Summers, a 23-year-old staff member still within her 4th month on the job, sensed something was off, but instead of intervening, she bowed her head to fold silk scarves, her hands trembling slightly, her gaze averted. At that moment, Andrea was heading toward the fitting area, carrying the Swarovski crystal-encrusted emerald gown, unaware that every one of her gestures had been silently judged in Constance's internal verdict. When Andrea disappeared behind the fitting room door, Constance leaned closer to Eleanor and spoke again, this time louder. "Just wait. Girls like that only come in to take pictures for the internet. Not one of them could afford a hanger in here." A young couple nearby froze mid-selection in front of a display of ties, their ears unintentionally drawn to the remark. The husband glanced at his wife, lips tight as if he meant to say something, but held back. The air in the boutique grew heavy, despite the steady classical music still flowing from the in-ceiling speakers. Constance, bathed in the sparkle of crystal chandeliers, resembled a queen of another era, needing no voice to carry her judgment. Her every movement dripped with a lifetime of bias. And in her mind, Andrea wasn't a customer. She was a trespasser in a place not meant for her. No one spoke up. Not a single employee clarified. Silence hung in the air, letting the prejudice seep into every corner like an expensive but suffocating perfume. And that was the moment when prejudice began to draw its own dividing line, splitting the boutique into two worlds: those who belonged and those who should leave. What Constance Whitmore didn't know was that the girl she judged so severely was the daughter of the most powerful person behind it all. In the private space of fitting room number 3, the largest in the boutique, adorned with carved silver mirrors and gleaming walnut floors, Andrea stood silently before her reflection. The floor-length emerald gown, with its precisely cut waist and an overlay of tulle embroidered with Swarovski crystals, shimmered under the lights like a constellation on a summer night. That shade of green, subtle yet regal, elevated Andrea's amber-brown skin to something almost mythical. She turned slowly, gently lifting the hem of the dress, each step like walking a red carpet, or standing center stage at the Grand Regency Hotel ballroom, where the spring gala would take place with over 400 guests in attendance, including major donors, pharmaceutical CEOs, and Department of Education representatives. In her mind, Andrea was no longer just a teenage girl. She was the face of hundreds of minority youths who had overcome bias to earn scholarships from the Carter Impact Foundation, founded by her father, who had always told Dee, "When you walk into a room where everyone doubts you, let your dignity speak before you do." While Andrea savored this quiet moment inside, outside, the air was warping under a force named Constance Whitmore. She approached Olivia Summers, the young brunette employee, a recent graduate in fashion merchandising from a community college. With the gravity of a strict headmistress, Constance lowered her voice just enough to be overheard. "That girl. I notice she's acting rather suspicious, touching dresses and glancing around. I'm not saying she's stealing, but who knows?" It wasn't a suspicion. It was a push that forced Olivia into a defensive stance, nudged other staff into alert mode, and most crucially, shoved Andrea out of the unspoken safety zone usually extended to customers. Olivia hesitated, visibly confused. She had never dealt with a situation like this before. Nowhere in training was there a module for how to respond when a VIP customer subtly implies racial bias. So, reflexively, she nodded, without fully understanding what, if anything, she was agreeing to. Then, as if on cue, the fitting room door opened. Andrea stepped out, shoulders straight, eyes bright, lips gently pressed, as though holding something within. What she didn't realize was that the entire boutique had shifted. The glances weren't merely curious now. They were guided. A woman holding a dress paused mid-aisle, pretending to smooth fabric, while her eyes flicked to Andrea. A man browsing red ties unconsciously held his breath. No one said anything, but no one was looking. Constance, the stage director in her theater, stepped forward, her storm gray heels tapping softly against the marble. She stopped just half a step from Andrea, tilted her head, and smiled. "That dress, truly stunning. But are you sure you can afford it?" Andrea didn't react immediately. The question, though sugar-coated, was a strike, a test wrapped in faux curiosity. She took a deep breath, smiled politely. "I believe it's the perfect fit for my father's charity event." That answer made the atmosphere skip a beat. No one laughed. A few people stepped back slightly, forming an invisible circle as if something significant was about to unfold. Constance narrowed her eyes, her voice rising half a tone. "What does your father do? DJ? Warehouse manager? Or a friend who works here?" The insult slithered out like snake venom. Andrea, still standing before the mirror, paused. Her shoulders tightened, and her fingers clutched the dress lightly. But she didn't lose composure. She didn't get angry. She didn't strike back. She simply turned and walked toward the display of high heels, her eyes never avoiding Constance's gaze, but never falling into it either. That response, not excessive, not lacking, nearly unsettled Constance, because the one she targeted refused to crumble. And what she hadn't yet understood was, Andrea hadn't stepped into her game. She was rewriting the rules. At that moment, La Belle's boutique was no longer a place of fashion or luxury. It had become an unscripted theater, where every glance, every raised eyebrow, every soft footstep carried weight. And Constance Whitmore, in her self-appointed role as guardian of this space's moral fabric, decided to push one step further, not with a threat, but with a sugar-coated insinuation, sweet as poison candy. She turned to Olivia Summers, the young manager behind the counter, whose hands had begun visibly trembling. "I just saw her," Constance said, lowering her voice but loud enough for a few nearby customers to hear. "Slip something into her backpack. I don't want to make false accusations. but we can't afford to be careless about security." Olivia froze, her eyes locked on Constance's, as if pleading for forgiveness before doing something she deeply didn't want to. Inside, she knew there wasn't reason to suspect Andrea. This was pure bias, and worse, prejudice. But Olivia also knew Constance Whitmore was a VVIP client, someone who had once donated $30,000 at the boutique's charity dress auction. So Olivia, with a voice as soft as a falling leaf, slowly walked toward Andrea. Her fingers clenched a pen so tightly that the cap was crushed. Andrea," she stammered, We just need to check your bag for a moment, just to clear things up." Andrea turned. Her face froze for a split second, as if an invisible punch had struck her dignity. "I haven't taken anything," she said, her voice not loud, but each word crystal clear. "But if this ends this nonsense, then go ahead." She opened her backpack and placed it on the marble countertop, cold as ice. Olivia, hands still trembling, began removing each item, laying them out carefully. A worn brown leather wallet, engraved with the name Andrea C., an old silver-cased iPhone 11 with a shock-proof cover, a tube of Vaseline lip balm, a Crestwood High School student ID, a small spiral-bound notebook, filled with handwritten notes for her speech at the gala. Olivia paused. Her eyes scanned the items. Her lips parted, about to say something. But before she could, a customer's voice rang out. "There's nothing there." The voice wasn't loud, but it pierced the boutique's inflated bubble like a needle. Customers pretending to browse dresses froze. Someone inhaled sharply. Others tilted their heads, as if witnessing something unacceptable. But Constance Whitmore, true to form, didn't know when to stop. "You didn't check thoroughly," she said louder, her hand gripping her designer bag strap like she was ready to hurl it at someone. "Girls like her. They know how to hide things. You should check the lining, the bottom, and the small compartments inside." Andrea looked up. Her eyes were no longer those of a teenage girl. They were cold, sharp, and unyielding, like forged steel. "Girls like me," she repeated, each word cutting through the air like a blade. The boutique fell into sudden silence. The background music stopped. The clatter of heels ceased. All that remained was the terrifying quiet of dozens of people standing at a crossroads, to speak up or to look away. No one answered her. But every eye, willingly or not, went to Constance. Andrea calmly placed each item back into her bag. Her hands did not shake. Her head did not bow. She zipped it up with a deliberate, measured motion, like sealing a verdict on a sham trial. "I don't need to prove anything else," she said, her gaze fixed on Constance. "I didn't steal. I'm not a criminal. And I won't tolerate being humiliated just because I'm black." The statement didn't need to be loud. It reached every corner, every air vent, every soul in that boutique, like an indictment of silent complicity. Olivia stood frozen like a wax figure, and Constance's face turned crimson, as if slashed open. Yet tragically, she still didn't back down. Because of people like Constance, power is never wrong. It's merely yet to be proven right. The tension inside the boutique had now thickened into something almost liquid, seeping through every doorframe, every fingertip, every stare. No one said it aloud, but every person in La Bellise Couture could feel it. Something more than mere discomfort was unfolding. Something was wrong. Olivia Summers, 23 years old, the young manager with a gemstone name tag pinned to her left chest, could barely breathe. No training session had ever prepared her to handle a racial crisis in an opulent boutique. And Constance Whitmore, watching from behind with an insistent glare, seemed to be pumping more pressure into every vessel in Olivia's body. She bit her lower lip, then turned to Andrea, her voice trembling like cold wind slipping through glass. I think it's best if you leave the store." A sentence, soft as a whisper, yet heavy as a verdict, read aloud by the keeper of justice. For a second, everything froze. Andrea blinked. She didn't cry. She didn't back away. She asked, not loudly, but with a precision that struck the heart of anyone who still believed in fairness. "I'm being kicked out, even though I've done nothing wrong?" No one answered. And in that silence, Constance laughed. A sharp, bitter laugh that rang out through the gold-leafed walls and the haze of French perfume. "See?" she said, turning to the nearest customers, as if offering a lecture. "This is how trouble starts. Small, then it spirals. Best to nip it early." Andrea looked at her, not with anger, but with a cold, cutting disappointment. Then she unlocked her phone, not rushed, not dramatic. And yet everyone in the boutique, from the woman holding a $14,200 white dress to the young man trying on a suit, was suddenly captivated. She raised the phone to her ear. Her voice came out calm, but each word carried compression, restraint, control. "Dad, I'm at La Bellise boutique. I need you to come. Now." She hung up. A middle-aged woman in a beige trench coat, who had quietly watched everything, shook her head and whispered to her companion, "This is terrible. Terrible in a way that hurts." Constance sniffed, still unrelenting. "Probably calling her boyfriend to stir things up," she muttered, dripping with scorn, not even trying to keep it discreet. Olivia heard her. This time, she didn't dare lift her head. Her heart was pounding, her veins hot like they'd been ripped open. She was beginning to realize she might have just triggered something whose consequences would far exceed the authority granted by the little name tag that read manager. An older staff member, Ms. Ruth, who had worked there for 18 years, stepped back behind the handbag display. She pretended to rearrange the hooks, but really, it was to avoid Andrea's gaze, not because she agreed or disagreed, but because she understood. Silence now was also a form of choosing sides, and she wasn't brave enough to pick one yet. Andrea tucked her phone away. She took one step toward the large mirror in the center of the store, not to admire herself, but to face the space that now stood frozen, watching her every move. Then, in a voice curiously calm and low, she said, "I've learned something today. That in the most glamorous places, sometimes, people try to push you out using the gentlest words." No one moved. Constance stood there still, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smirk, diluted by her authority. Olivia, somewhere between guilt and dread, had let the pen in her hand fall to the floor. Andrea turned her back to them all, standing among scattered gazes, her posture straight like a classical pillar. No one knew. In just a few minutes, the world inside La Bellise would change forever. But in that moment, one thing was undeniable. The girl they had dismissed had just opened the door for truth to walk in. A low, rumbling sound echoed from outside, like the subdued growl of something unstoppable. Every gaze inside La Bellise Couture simultaneously turned toward the large glass panels at the front of the store. A sleek black Cadillac Escalade ESV slowly rolled into the VIP parking zone, its LED headlights slicing through the marble facade in sharp beams of white light. The vehicle bore a personalized license plate with just 3 characters. DCR, enough for anyone familiar with high finance or haute couture to recognize instantly. The rear door swung open. The first to step out was a broad-shouldered man in a hand-tailored Italian black suit, sunglasses covering half his face, a wireless earpiece glinting at his ear. He said nothing, but his eyes scanned the entire store, from the entrance to the checkout counter, before locking for an extra half-second on Constance Whitmore, as though identifying a target without needing confirmation. Then, the second figure emerged, A tall, sharply dressed man stepped from the car with a silence that carried weight. David Carter, the man once dubbed by Forbes as the man who redefined fashion retail, who turned a small Harlem boutique into a $3.8 billion empire, spanning 67 luxury stores from New York and Paris to Dubai. Today, he wore a deep navy Brioni suit, a crisp white shirt with a pointed collar, a smoky silk tie, and no jewelry, except for a simple wedding band worn down on one side, a quiet testament to 27 years of marriage and loss. The boutique door opened with a faint ting, absurdly delicate, like a dinner bell ringing at the wrong moment. Yet each of David Carter's footsteps echoed on the marble floor, measured, unwavering, like the beat of a war drum announcing that change had arrived. It was as if all oxygen had been sucked from the room. An elderly woman trying on Chanel shoes whispered under her breath, "That's David Carter. He owns the entire La Bellise chain." A young woman holding her phone froze, unable to snap a photo. Constance Whitmore, standing near the counter, suddenly seemed unusually small in the very space that once bowed to her gaze. She stammered, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. "No, it can't be. That's not him, is it?" David didn't stop to answer. He walked straight ahead, his cold eyes brushing over every face for no more than a third of a second. When he reached his daughter, he gently placed one hand on Andrea's shoulder, a touch that spoke both an unspoken apology and a fortress of protection she hadn't had for the past 20 minutes. He looked at her. Andrea looked up, eyes meeting his. No words were exchanged. Everything was understood. Then David Carter turned toward the counter, where Olivia stood petrified, and Constance hadn't quite found her breath again. His voice rang out, low, not loud, but sharp like a blade sliding from its sheath. "What's happening here?" Constance snapped out of her trance like someone shaken from sleep, immediately shifting her tone. It was still the same style, poison wrapped in velvet. "I was merely trying to protect the store's integrity from those who exhibited questionable behavior." David didn't react. No nod, no frown. He turned slightly to Olivia, his voice still cold, unmoved by any attempt at pleasantries. "You're the manager, correct? What did you do when you heard those baseless accusations?" Olivia swallowed hard, her throat tightening. We searched her bag. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing." David nodded faintly, and for the first time that afternoon, his eyes fixed directly on Constance Whitmore, like twin drills that didn't blink. "Who exactly did you just insult?" he asked, each word dropping like a slab of stone. "Do you even know who she is?" Silence. Constance, once the master of every room she entered, now found herself without footing. And for the first time in years, she had no response. Not because she didn't know, but because she knew all too well. This time, she had chosen the wrong target, and no one could save her from the consequences she had brought upon herself. The boutique now felt like a frozen painting in the middle of a storm. Every breath slowed, as if everyone was standing inside a historic moment, one where a single sentence could shift the entire balance. Constance Whitmore, still under the illusion that social status could erase moral consequence, tried to maintain a forced smile. She brushed her ash-blonde hair aside, flicked her wrist as if wiping away an imaginary speck of dust, and murmured in a tone laced with false delicacy, I just thought the girl didn't quite fit this store. She's not like the people who usually come here." Her voice still carried a confident lilt, like she was stating an obvious truth, something unworthy of dispute. But then, David Carter's calm, resonant voice filled the room. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. Each word sliced through the air like a surgeon's blade, cutting through years of denial. Not like them, because her skin's darker than yours, isn't it? That question, a quiet blade, cut straight through the veil of bias. No yelling, no exhibit of proof. Just one line, powerful enough to redirect every pair of eyes toward one place. Constance, and the guilt she was desperately trying to deny. The air inside the boutique felt vacuum-sealed. A woman holding a beige lace gown silently set it down, her hand trembling slightly. Olivia Summers backed up entirely, her spine pressed against the register, fingers clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. Constance had nowhere left to hide. She stuttered. I didn't know. She was... But David shut down every excuse before it could take form. You don't need to know who she is to treat her with decency. Respect isn't a reward for titles. It's a principle for anyone who still has a conscience. Andrea stood behind her father, her back straight like a pillar in a storm. Her eyes no longer spoke just for herself. They were the eyes of millions who had been excluded from spaces like this simply because they didn't fit the mold. It was the look of survival, of a generation that no longer bows. A middle-aged customer, Lorraine Kelly, a longtime patron and donor to arts education programs in Chicago, whispered to her husband, "I've never seen anyone stand as firmly as that girl. Never." Constance began searching for salvation with her eyes. She glanced around like a child lost in a crowded market, hoping someone would smile, nod, or at least look away. But no one did. All she found were gazes, cold, blank, or disappointed. David took one slow step toward her, not shouting, not threatening, but his voice rang out like a gavel striking marble. "You didn't just insult my daughter," he said, his gaze pressing the weight of judgment into every word. "You insulted the core moral principles my company has upheld since day one. That human dignity cannot be priced by skin tone, pedigree, or the glance of the wealthy." Constance, now like a marionette with snapped strings, teetered but didn't fall, clinging to a social smile as worn as an outdated coat. But David didn't wait another second. He declared, "No need for paperwork, no need for counsel. You've just closed the door to every store I own. As of today, you are permanently banned from entering any boutique under the Carter Luxe brand worldwide." The announcement needed no microphone. It rang like a decree from a moral high court. And in the stunned silence of the room, the final truth stood exposed. Constance Whitmore wasn't a distinguished guest. She was merely a relic of a crumbling era. In a strange moment, La Bellisse Boutique was no longer a place that sold fashion. It had become a silent courtroom, where the judge was conscience, the prosecutor was truth, and the jury was the gaze of the crowd. David Carter didn't raise his voice, didn't need more evidence. One decisive sentence closed the door on the reign of power Constance Whitmore had long held through prejudice. Mrs. Constance Whitmore, as of today, is permanently banned from setting foot in any store under the Carter Luxe Group. From New York to Beverly Hills, from Paris to Milan, all 67 boutiques carrying his brand would never again admit someone like her through their doors. A single door slammed shut in a luxurious suburban boutique, but to Constance, it was the sound of an entire world rejecting her. She stood frozen, her face, once carefully maintained with micro-needling, Botox, and Japanese serums, now stiff with something no spa could ever erase: humiliation. An elderly woman, petite with silver-cropped hair and a smoky tweed coat, stepped out from the fitting room. In her hands was a $5,900 lace dress. She calmly placed the gown on the counter, then turned to Constance, her voice not loud, but sharp as a rusted blade. "You may wear designer clothes all you want, But from now on, I refuse to wear the same brand as someone like you." A young father in a navy suit, holding hands with his 8-year-old daughter, clutching a cream-colored teddy bear, crouched to her level and spoke softly, but loud enough for all to hear. "Look, sweetheart, this is how someone destroys their dignity, with arrogance." Then he stood up, his gaze landing on Constance, not with anger, but with bone-deep disappointment. "Thank you. Because of you, my daughter now understands what baseless hatred looks like." Constance tried to move her feet, but her entire body felt glued to the cold marble floor. Her ash-purple Hermes Birkin bag, once a symbol of quiet power, slipped off her shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud. But she didn't bend to pick it up. Perhaps she knew that to bend now would be to admit collapse. Olivia Summers, who had once avoided eye contact, began to cry. Not because she feared for her job, not because David Carter had just spoken harshly. She cried because, for the first time, she realized she had stayed silent in the exact moment she should have spoken up. In the whirlwind of power, she had let fear dim her principles. And now, she cried not for others, but for herself. Andrea Carter remained where she stood. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't claim victory. She simply looked at Constance with a solemn gaze, the look of someone who had just seen the true face behind the mask of so-called respectability in high society. Because Andrea knew, the most dangerous form of violence isn't a punch, it's a dismissive glance, a sweetened insult with thorns, and exclusion disguised as civility. Constance staggered toward the door, no longer the stride of a powerful woman, but the lonely shadow of a decaying past. Every step she took across the floor fell like lead, dragging behind it the weight of silent contempt that clung to her Louboutins. When she touched the glass door, it opened, and the familiar ting rang out once more. But this time, it wasn't gentle. It was cold and slicing, a death knell for misplaced privilege. No one escorted her. No one said goodbye. Only eyes followed her. No hatred, no insults. Just indifference. The one thing someone like Constance feared most. A young woman near the glass turned to her friend and said quietly, her eyes still following the fading figure outside, "I'm going to tell my daughter this story. She needs to understand this, more than any history lesson in school." And she was right. La Bellise Boutique would never be the same again. Not because of new displays or fresh lighting or the launch of a fall collection, but because, from that day forward, everyone inside had seen the true portrait of power, silence, and consequence. The atmosphere inside the boutique remained thick with emotion, not anger, not outrage, but an awakening that spread like a slow-burning incense, persistent and impossible to ignore. David Carter, in a custom-tailored black suit from Italy, stood at the center of the room, like a pillar that had just shaken off the dust covering its honor, and the honor of the generation to come. He turned back, his gaze no longer the icy storm it had been when facing Constance, but calm and steady as he looked toward Olivia. The young woman, standing behind the cashier counter, had red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, still shaken by the weight of regret. David spoke, so softly it almost seemed no one could hear him, yet every word fell like a stone into a still lake. "You could have avoided this stain if you had spoken up sooner." Olivia bowed her head. Her throat was dry as sand. She couldn't find any words except one simple truth. "I was scared. Scared of losing my job. Scared of confronting a major customer. Scared I wasn't strong enough." David nodded, not harshly. "And it's exactly because everyone is scared that people like her think they can act that way." That statement wasn't meant as punishment for Olivia. It was meant for everyone, in that boutique that day, and for those out there living in polished rooms where prejudice is tolerated in silence. No one spoke. The background music was gone, the tapping of heels on marble silenced. All that remained was quiet, the only thing deep enough to hold a lesson about humanity. David turned to the entire staff, from the receptionist to the person arranging bags behind the display. He didn't lecture, didn't give a speech. He simply spoke as someone who had lived long enough to know kindness is both a skill and a responsibility. Fairness isn't something to consider, it's a survival standard. If a business lacks ethics, then even with $1 billion revenue, we are bankrupt. A customer nodded slowly. One of the window dressers placed a hand over their heart, then let it fall. A quiet gesture of internal commitment. Andrea, still standing near the emerald gown, stepped beside her father. No longer the teenage girl picking a dress for a gala. In that moment, she embodied a new generation, where power came not from lineage or status, but from self-possession. David looked at his daughter, the gaze of a father who had just seen his child pass a test no textbook could ever teach. He asked gently, as if to shield whatever bruises might still linger inside her, "Are you okay?" Andrea nodded lightly. Her eyes still glistened, but with emotion, not tears. "I held on to the one thing that matters most, my dignity." David smiled, not the smile of someone who had won a battle, but the smile of a man who had watched his child remain unshaken by hate. A father's smile for a daughter who chose the right thing. Not silence, not retaliation, but to stand tall. Then he turned to everyone, his voice steady, as if speaking to thousands, though he stood in the center of just one store. If anyone leaves here today with anything, not a dress, not a receipt, let it be this: skin color is never a measure of a person's worth. His words echoed against the glass walls, then reflected in the eyes of everyone present. And in the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the dome above, the boutique was no longer merely a place that sold luxury fabrics. It had become the site of a moral declaration, a place that had witnessed an act of prejudice, and in that same place, gave rise to a generation that would never let it happen again. Andrea and David exited the boutique through the back door, a white stone hallway usually reserved for senior managers, a place far from customers and noise. It was down that very corridor Andrea had once followed her father, barely waist-high, still clutching a lollipop, listening to meetings she didn't understand, except for one word: responsibility. But today, each step she took down that hallway was different. She was no longer the little girl of the past, but a young woman who had just emerged from a public moral battle, victorious not through power, but through poise. She turned to glance at the glass doors far behind, where mannequins still stood motionless behind thick panes. They were no longer just fashion figures, but silent witnesses to an afternoon that had redefined what luxury truly meant. No longer labels or price tags, but dignity and the courage to stand tall amid prejudice. David placed a firm hand on his daughter's shoulder. Without lengthy speeches, he said one sentence, an utterance that seemed to etch itself into the bones of an entire generation. The world may judge you, but only you have the right to define yourself. The late afternoon sun poured down like honey, gilding the boutique's glass and casting reflections of two departing figures onto the white floor. But the resonance of that day didn't leave. It lingered in every detail, every shimmer of light, every breeze against the windows. Constance Whitmore had gone. Her presence would never again haunt that shopping district. But what she left behind was not a Hermes bag or a sneer of superiority, but the remnants of a mindset that had ruled unchecked for far too long. That shadow of prejudice hadn't vanished, but today it had been illuminated under the quiet spotlight of justice. That very night, a company-wide internal announcement was sent across the Carter Lux Group global system. The header, bold in red, read, "Zero tolerance policy on discrimination." Below was the declaration, "Any behavior rooted in bias, racial, class-based, gender-related, will be dealt with immediately, without requiring formal complaint. Customer dignity is the core of this brand." At the same moment, Andrea sat in her private room. The walls were white, and the window overlooked a lavender garden she and her mother had planted in 6th grade. In front of her was a soft pink leather journal, once filled with teenage dreams, now turned to a new page. She wrote in purple ink, "What kept me standing today wasn't the truth itself. It was how I carried that truth. I don't need to shout to be believed. I just need to never bow my head." Olivia, the young staff member who once trembled as she followed a wrongful order, had submitted a request to transfer to the Brooklyn branch. Not to run away, but to relearn what it meant to be a courageous manager. In her transfer note, she wrote, "I don't want to work in a place where everything runs on silence. I want to learn how to do the right thing, even when no one's clapping yet." On social media, a young customer, the very man who had stood beside his daughter in the boutique, posted a phone video. The moment David Carter walked in, the moment Andrea calmly spoke, the moment Constance awkwardly departed. The clip, only 2 minutes and 13 seconds long, garnered over 3 million views in 36 hours, becoming a modern moral lesson, shared by teachers and parent groups across America. In the video caption, the father wrote, "I don't teach my daughter that she's a princess. I teach her that she deserves respect." And today, a young woman named Andrea proved it, not by shouting, but by standing tall. And so, the story closed, not with a fairy tale ending, no fireworks, no crown, but with the echo of a theme song that refused to fade from the mind. Because in a world where everything has a price, perhaps dignity is the one thing that can't be bought, but must always be kept. Something had begun to change. Join us in sharing meaningful stories by clicking like and subscribing. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you can start each day with lessons that matter and with the kind of empathy the world needs more of.